Narcissism is a deficit in an ability to deal with aggression. They want attention. And they realize that the only way for them to gain this attention or infamy is to, unfortunately, to perpetrate a mass shooting. We did psychological profiles on every perpetrator of every mass murder. So I looked at every single...
Since 1900?
Since 1900. So all 2,300 of these cases, I looked at every single case. We boiled it down to this 3-point psychological profile. Number 1.
Dr. Ragy Girgis, how does narcissism affect the chances that someone will become a mass shooter?
There are a lot of ways to look at narcissism, and we have to clear up what narcissism actually is. So from the psychodynamic perspective, we understand narcissism in a slightly different way than a lot of people might understand narcissism. I know you've obviously gone over this a lot in your shows, but just to clarify, when a lot of people hear narcissism, they think that narcissism primarily involves grandiosity, arrogance. Those are certainly components of what we might consider narcissism, or the categorical definition of narcissistic personality disorder, for sure, and they're important, kind of along the lines of the myth of Narcissus. Narcissus was a very beautiful hunter. He basically was walking by a pool of water one day. He saw his reflection in the mirror. He was so entranced by and enmeshed with his reflection because he was so beautiful that he just ignored everything. He didn't eat, and he essentially died and became a flower. So there's like the Narcissus flower. So that is how a lot of people understand narcissism. That's a part of narcissism. And people might also think that these people have like a high self-esteem, those sorts of things. Narcissism from the psychodynamic perspective is a little different. So from the psychodynamic perspective, fundamentally, narcissism involves low self-esteem. So that can be manifested as like arrogance and grandiosity, but fundamentally low self-esteem. There are two, I think, dominant or primary psychodynamic theories or formulations of narcissism. Those come from Otto Kernberg and Heinz Kohut. These are dominant figures in psychodynamics. So for example, Freud, Jung, these are psychodynamic theorists. Kernberg and Kohut came maybe a little later than, for example, Freud and Jung, but these are dominant psychodynamic theorists. Otto Kernberg is actually still alive. He's affiliated with Columbia. I actually received a couple lectures from Dr. Kernberg when I was a resident here at Columbia. It was really exciting. Yeah. But either way, that's a bit of a digression. He's amazing. I would encourage people to read his work. Either way, so the two predominant theories of narcissism, psychodynamic theories of narcissism, come from Kernberg and Kohut. In essence, Kohut says that narcissism comes from deficient, basically mirroring as a child. So not receiving from your parents that mirroring kind of support or empathy, whatever that we need to receive to develop into a kind of a complete, psychodynamically complete adult. That's part of the kind of self-psychology theory, the greater self-psychology theory. Now, Kernberg used a more object relations type of kind of approach to his understanding of narcissism. Kernberg categorizes personality into 4 different levels of organization. There's the mature organization, there's the neurotic organization, there's the borderline organization, and there's the psychotic organization. The borderline organization is typified by identity diffusion, like not understanding where you what your place is in the world, how you relate to people, those sorts of things. You use splitting-based defenses like projective identification, splitting, those sorts of things. And in times of stress, you have problems with the reality testing. So people with narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder would fall in the borderline personality disorder range. They have difficulties with impulse control. They have difficulties with mood stabilization, anxiety tolerance, and fundamentally, and this is what I'm getting to, sorry, this is the long-winded way of saying it. Fundamentally, narcissism is a deficit, a developmental deficit in an ability to deal with aggression. That is the fundamental kind of formulation and explanation for narcissism in Kernberg's theory. And again, he is one of the two, he created or developed one of the two dominant theories of narcissism. So then I guess it just becomes clear. You have narcissism. It's a problem with an ability to manage your aggressive impulses, and then you get aggression.
And then how does it translate to what you found about the mind of a mass shooter? How does it connect there?
Right. So it's fundamental to take. So there are many ways we can go, but to boil everything down, we looking at thousands of mass shooters since 1900 all over the world and actually comparing mass shooters with other types of mass murders, we found we boiled it down to this 3-point psychological profile. Number one is a fascination with or affinity for firearms. Not just availability of firearms is relevant, but it's fascination with or affinity for firearms. Number two, it's nihilism. Nihilism, taken to its most extreme, manifests as suicide. About 50% of mass shooters in America take their life at the time of the event. That's an incredibly high. There's no other group or small sample of people demonstrates or has that high of a prevalence of taking one's life. It's incredibly high. And then number three is we add the word toxic or malignant narcissism. That is fundamental. It's really redundant. And maybe now people might understand why the words toxic or malignant would be considered redundant, because that's kind of essentially in the psychodynamic sense of the word what narcissism is. But it's this narcissism. That is what makes people take out their aggression, for example, on other people. That is fundamental to narcissism. Again, it's these aggressive impulses. People who are fundamentally narcissists are extremely angry and violent towards other people. That also explains and kind of accounts for the third fundamental component or kind of explanation or part of the psychological profile of mass shooters, in particular public mass shooters, which is fame, the great desire for infamy. That is actually what determines whether someone perpetrates a mass shooting in public, like a school shooting, or in private, which are actually the most common type. But that's how fundamental narcissism is, especially to the public type of mass shooting.
Okay. So the narcissism comes in that piece of looking for the infamy, and it's that desire for attention, as well as the issue with handling your aggression and the nihilism. It's kind of mixed into these three major factors that you have. Exactly.
It's fundamental to why anyone would even perpetrate a mass shooting publicly as opposed to privately. So that's kind of an addition. So it's particularly important to a public mass shooter, like a school shooter, as opposed to for a non-public mass shooting would be, for example, a family mass shooting, a domestic event in which usually a middle-aged man takes the life of his family after losing his job or finding out that his partner is being unfaithful or something along those lines. That actually represents the most common type of mass shooting, 45% of all mass shootings, and then about 33% are felonious mass shootings, and then about 13 to 15% are public mass shootings. So narcissism is particularly related to the public mass shootings because of, one, this inability to manage their aggressive impulses, but then also, two, the desire for infamy. But narcissism, because of the ability of people who are narcissistic to manage their aggressive impulses, also contributes to, is very important for all the different types of mass shootings.
Okay. So what does the progression of a person's psychology look like if they're a very narcissistic person, narcissistic personality disorder, something like that, and then they come to a point in their life where they become a mass shooter? What has to happen to kind of walk that path?
Yeah, well, exactly. I like how you frame it, because you're getting at a point which I think we only truly understood recently, and that is that people don't become a mass shooter overnight. These are not like super impulsive events. In many cases, these actually develop over months and years. Only about 20% of mass shootings are actually fully impulsive. And most of the ones with which we know, like the public mass shootings, develop over months to years. So it's a combination of things. So fundamentally, there are a lot of issues going on. Primarily, ultimately, mass shootings are related to evil and those sorts of things. Why someone would do something like this, it's, a very evil thing. But, so that's most fundamentally. But after that, number one, these people, and not to be too redundant, but these people have major characterological deficits. Character develops very early on. And that's why, this is, again, somewhat redundant, but this is why it's so important for people to examine this sort of thing, to understand psychodynamic theory. Psychodynamic theory ultimately is just an understanding of human nature. So our character is determined when we're very young. So it's then when our ability to tolerate anxiety, stabilize our mood, manage our impulses, etc., are determined. So that's kind of the basis for this, the foundation for that. So that develops when you're very young. Then, these people have difficulties for many years. In most cases, although sometimes we hear online or when we're watching news reports about mass shootings that these people were kind of, had no other problems. They seemed like very nice people, etc. Often you would find that this person actually has had problems for a long time, difficulties with aggression, impulse control, and violence. So that's been going on for a long time, school age years, into high school and teenage years and college, adolescence, and all those sorts of things. And then a number of things can happen. One, they could start using substances, which could, obviously disinhibit them. And it's often a combination of the things. Two, they could be confronted with some sort of major life event. So in the case of a middle-aged person, this often involves, again, someone cheating on them, or in the case of a younger person, a partner cheating on them or being unfaithful, loss of a job, loss of a parent, those sorts of things. So some sort of major life stress. And then a few other things are going on. In many cases, these people become or develop, as I mentioned, a fascination with or affinity for firearms. So it's not just about gun availability, which is for the most part universal. Something leads, and again, over years, something leads to this person developing a great fascination with affinity for firearms. We see that in almost every case. And then often the final step is that these people develop, as I mentioned, this severe nihilism. They decide that their life is empty. There's nothing to live for, and they would feel better just not being alive and then ultimately taking their life. So you have all of that. And then finally, in many cases, especially in the case of public mass shooters, these people who feel very badly about themselves, have not accomplished very much, want to take their life, basically want to go out in some sort of, as they say, blaze of glory. They want attention for whatever reason. And they realize that the only way for them to gain this attention or infamy is to, unfortunately, to perpetrate a mass shooting. And that's kind of how we build from, development, 1, 2, as a toddler to perpetrating a mass shooting.
Yes. And Ragy, you're pointing out psychodynamic theory. What is that in contrast to, and why is that contrast so important?
Well, it's very important to understand. I mean, I guess there are many ways to formulate how we understand mass shootings. Ultimately, it comes to character. As opposed to it being different than anything else, I think it just provides a better understanding of a lot of the other ways we characterize and kind of describe mass shootings. Mass shooters, rather. So, for example, there are many ways of describing, again, these phenomena. So we often use, as you mentioned, the phrase narcissistic personality disorder. That is a very important way of understanding things. We use narcissistic personality disorder. It's categorical, and it's based on a lot of the things we've discussed, and also psychopathy and even words like evil and all these sorts of things. This just kind of helps us understand how even narcissistic personality disorder develops, what it means, fundamentally being an inability to deal with aggressive impulses, which we can then understand would contribute to all the different criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. It also helps us to understand things like, words like sociopathy and antisocial and psychopathy, for example. All of these because all of these categorical, diagnoses or terms are actually related. They're actually related to the fundamental psychodynamic understanding and theory of narcissism. They all come from the same inability to deal with, impulses as a child, or the lack of the mere kind of empathy or response from that one normally gets from one's parents. So again, going back to the Kernbergian way of understanding things, these people, the mass shooters and people with narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder, they are organized in the Kernberg structure at the borderline level. These people, so again, to use the psychodynamic parlance to help us understand what this is all about, these people have identity diffusion. That that, contributes to a lot of what's going on. So they don't know who they are. They don't know how they should interact with people. They don't know their place in the world. They use splitting-based defenses. They use projective identification. So a lot of people have heard of projection. Projective identification is even a less mature version of projection. This is where you, instead of, I guess, realizing or attributing problems or conflicts or anything that is a slightly difficult for you to deal with to yourself, like difficult feelings or aggressive feelings, you project them onto someone else. You attribute them to something else. And then what projective identification is that you actually, it's very immature because you do that and then you actually make the other person feel that way. It's really quite immature and dangerous. Either way. And then, of course, there's the impaired reality testing in times of stress. So thinking about those kind of three criteria for a borderline personality organization, you can understand where each of the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder come from. The psychological profile, for example, of mass shooters. And then again, psychopathy or sociopathy, which are very much related to narcissistic personality. These have to do with, most of these are defined in many ways by, not just by how they're feeling, but also by their behaviors. And especially these antisocial behaviors.
Mm-hmm. So what would be other schools of thought besides the psychodynamic theory, just so we can understand it by contrast?
Sure. So for example, cognitive behavioral theory, which is basically that you have thoughts, cognitions or thoughts that affect your behaviors, and that makes a lot of sense. And also behaviors can affect your thoughts. That also very much applies. Cognitive behavioral theory, developed by Aaron Beck, was very much based on psychodynamic theory. I see these as being very related. So for example, if your thoughts are that you have nothing to add to, you have nothing to contribute to the society, people don't like you, you have no friends, and you're not desirable to anyone, not necessarily in a romantic sense, but in any sense, you can understand. So if that is a cognition, you can understand then that your behavior might be antisocial as opposed to prosocial. Prosocial behaviors would be making friends and participating in a steady job and helping people. Antisocial behaviors include hurting people, not having friends, being mean to people. Those are antisocial behaviors. And so I think these are just different ways of understanding things. Fundamental to all of them is, again, psychodynamic theory. Another psychological kind of way of understanding people is, for example, interpersonal theory. These are all kind of just ways of describing the same thing. So it's not necessarily one or the other per se. It's just all ways of understanding the same thing. And fundamental to all of them, and cognitive behavioral therapists and theorists and people who study interpersonal theory, they readily acknowledge this. These are just kind of other ways of understanding psychodynamic theory and are certainly very much informed by psychodynamic theory. It just helps us kind of understand the basis for all of the different ways of thinking about things.
Okay. Ragy, I'd love to go deeper on these three key identifiers of a mass shooter. First, though, just to give people context, what do we need to know about your background to understand what you bring to this field of understanding the mind of a mass shooter?
Sure, absolutely. I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm a physician who's focused on psychiatric illness. I've been doing this for about 20 years. I'm a full-time researcher at Columbia University. My main area is basically developing new medications for people with schizophrenia using brain imaging and clinical trials. I, about 5 to 10 years ago, began to focus on violence and using brain imaging and clinical trials within violence, within the field of schizophrenia, in particular, people with schizophrenia who are violent. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, after, hearing about all these mass shootings and everything that was going on and seeing that a lot of people in the media and otherwise were kind of blaming mass shootings primarily on people with psychiatric illnesses. And when we mean psychiatric illnesses in the context of mass shootings, we're primarily talking about people with psychotic disorders. My colleagues and I really wanted to, as definitively as possible for ourselves, determine what the relationship between mental illness and psychotic illness in particular and mass shootings is. So we put together the Columbia Mass Murder Database. This is the largest database of all types of mass murder in the world by far. We collected data on all mass murders around the world from 1900 until today, including, again, mass murderers who use firearms or mass shooters. We use the word mass murderers who use firearms rather than mass shooters all the time because about 20% of mass shooters actually use other weapons. So, for example, one mass shooting with which people are very familiar is the 1966 Texas at Austin. I think it was like the Bell Tower mass shooting. That's kind of like the one that people say like started the epidemic. We've actually had mass shootings for forever, but that's kind of the one that people refer to as starting the epidemic. That person actually used another method before he even started using his firearms. In that case, I believe he smothered a family member in their home before he went to the campus and started shooting people. So either way, about 20% of mass shooters actually use other weapons in addition to the firearms. So either way, we examined all types of mass murders, including mass murderers who didn't use firearms at all, because we thought that would be the most appropriate way to examine causes of and motivations of and associations with mass shootings. Because, one wants to, whenever one does research, one wants to avoid bias or effects that one might see but are not related to the actual effects we want to examine. One wants to use a comparison group that is as closely related to the group to limit those biases. So that we want to understand mass shooters. So what group is most related to mass shooting without that one variable that we're examining? Because you have to kind of isolate that one variable. In our case, that variable is firearms. So we thought that the most appropriate comparison group would be mass murderers who use other weapons. So that way we focus on firearms. Why do people use firearms to perpetrate mass murder as opposed to other weapons? So that's the background. We have now about 2,300 mass murders, cases of mass murder in our database. I created this database with Dr. Gary Ricardo, who is really an expert in this sort of thing. And we have about 50 different variables for all of these people. And it's from that we we publish on the database and on this information, and we understand what we now understand about mass shootings.
Okay. And so in your work, you've established that there are these three big identifiers for potential mass shooters or people who commit mass murder with firearms. There's the fascination with firearms, the nihilism, and the desire for infamy. How did you conclude that those are the three things?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for the question. So a lot of data and results went into this. And I think we've published about 10 studies on this now. There are a lot of, contributors to mass shootings. So the way to think about causes, for example, of mass shootings is to think of a pie, like a circle, like a pie, and to think of different slices in that pie. And all the different, quote unquote, causes of mass shootings are different slices of that pie. So one slice of that pie, for example, and the first thing that we examined, as I mentioned, was the contribution of mental illness, and particularly psychotic illness, to mass shooting. And we have a number. The number is 5%. 5% of mass shootings are directly caused by psychotic illness. So that is an overrepresentation because about 1 to 2% of people in the general population have a psychotic illness. So psychosis is overrepresented among mass shooters, but it contributes 5%. So about 95% are caused by something else. And a lot of these causes, for example, do overlap. Another kind of finding from our work was that 50% now, and this has been increasing over time, whereas, for example, the prevalence of psychosis among mass shooters has actually been decreasing over time. So we were able to look over time because we've been collecting data from 1900. So what's increasing over time is the prevalence of suicide, taking one's life at the time of the event. So when we think about suicide attempts, most suicide attempts do not end in a suicide. But when we look at mass shooters, almost all mass shooters who attempt to take their life at the time of the event actually end up taking their life at the time of the event. It's really quite unusual. Suicide among mass shooters is quite different than suicide among the general population. So now, again, this has been increasing over time. 50% of mass shooters in America take their life at the time of the event. Why is this important, and how does this understand, or how did this bring us to this 3-point psychological profile? So it does in a few ways. Number one, The way we understand any sort of major event, like, for example, like a mass murder, is that there are three barriers to a mass murder or a mass shooter in this case. Number one is one's own moral system or value. So that, values rather. So that in the psychodynamic sense, that is your super ego, or also your ego, but in particular your super ego, or your conscience, or your religion, your belief in God and desire to avoid sin, those sorts of things. So that's your value system, your moral values. The second barrier is that morality or the value system that you internalize from people around you or society. So from parents, from partners, or from society. Number three is the desire to avoid getting caught and going to prison. So once you decide to take your life, that third hurdle is removed. That third barrier is removed. And it becomes that much easier to perpetrate a mass shooting. That is why it's so important. And that's kind of why we're seeing this very high number, especially now. So that's important both to the prevalence of suicide among mass shooters, but also to the hugely increasing number of mass shooters that we've been seeing over the past 20 to 30 years per capita. So that's suicide. And suicide also is very much related to the first point of the psychological profile, firearms. As we know, and as many people know, the means of suicide that's most or the weapon, I guess we can say, that's like, for example, as opposed to poisoning or hanging or other ways of taking one's life, the method of taking one's life that's most associated with taking one's life is guns or firearms. Mm-hmm. So these points converge very much. Those are ways in which we understand or have come to this. In addition, we did psychological profiles on every perpetrator of every mass murder. So I looked at every single
1900?
Since 1900. So all 2,300 of these cases, I looked at every single case, read everything that was available about them, primarily from court and police records, and then whatever's available in media sources, which are actually quite reliable. We actually compared media sources reliable media sources to court and police records, and the consistency is really quite incredible. Either way, so I looked at every case, and my colleague, Dr. Bricado, who's a forensic psychologist and he has many expertise, but one of his main expertise is forensic psychology, and he's written books about it. And he was previously at Columbia. Each of us looked at every case and examined the motive in every single case. So we also came to this profile from that sense. But in addition to that, on a kind of a macro scale, using like descriptive statistics and inferential statistics, we also just very much examined the relationship between mass shootings and other types of mass murders, but mass shootings in particular, and firearm policy. So we know a lot about firearms. We know exactly how many firearms are manufactured in the U.S., for example, every year, and we can quantify the strength of firearm laws in the U.S. And what we found, and of course, across countries, that's very easy. So we looked at a number of things. So number one is across countries, it's very clear. Countries with more firearms, either just in number, or certainly per capita, and also weaker firearms, very clearly have higher rates of mass shootings per capita. The data are very strong. It's very clear. This isn't necessarily. I can go into more how the Second Amendment relates to this. It's not as clearly related to the Second Amendment. I can share with people exactly how that is the case, but I'll focus right now just kind of specifically on the laws as opposed to just the Second Amendment per se, because the data on kind of the Second Amendment is. The data are less clear, and I'll go into that. So that's with regards to, the effects of firearm policies on mass shooting rates per capita around the world. Also, just within the U.S., on a state-by-state basis, the states with weaker firearm laws have much higher rates of mass shootings per capita. And that's even the case on a more kind of limited, county, even neighborhood level. And this applies actually to mass shootings, all types of gun violence, and suicide. The relationship between just firearm availability and also weaker firearm laws and mass shootings, events per capita and victims per capita, very, 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 very strong. That is, we even, looking even at the assault weapon ban, which I think that was implemented guess it was a long time ago now. I think that was implemented. You might know more about this than I did, but the assault weapon ban was basically a ban in place on assault weapons from, I think, about 1994 to 2004, I want to say. And even, looking, so that would be those data would be nationwide. That would be a nationwide effect, the federal assault weapon ban. FAWB, if people want to look it up. So that started in 1994, I believe ended in 2004. And there is an effect. The effect isn't quite as strong as the state data, but there's the suggestion that the assault weapon ban did limit the number of mass shootings. And then after the assault weapon ban, the per capita rate of mass shootings skyrocketed. That's very clear. And that's relevant because although earlier on, like pre-2000, pre-1980, semi-automatic weapons, and so an assault weapon, maybe a lot of people already know this, but just to clarify what all these terms mean, an assault weapon is basically defined as any semi-automatic weapon, or certainly fully automatic weapon, but any semi-automatic weapon that has any modification. So, for example, a pistol grip, is foldable, any sort of high capacity, any modification that makes it higher capacity, like a high capacity magazine, for example. So an assault weapon is any semi-automatic weapon that has some sort of modification. So the assault weapon ban then again is relevant because although non-automatic weapons were the most commonly used firearms in mass shootings, earlier on, like pre-2000, now semi-automatic weapons in particular, and assault weapons to some degree, semi-automatic weapons are the most commonly used weapons. So all these kind of results and data converge on the importance of, or the relevance of firearm laws to mass shootings. And again, that's in addition to the motivational analysis we did when we examined basically the psychological profile of all of these mass shooters.
Mm-hmm. So, Ragy, let's do a little more to put together kind of the mind and the decisions of this person. So if you're a mass shooter, you are using a firearm when the firearm is not actually necessarily the most effective way by the numbers to kill many people, right? There's evidence that other methods actually would kill more people. But the choice is the firearm because of the fascination with firearm. It's also the effective weapon for suicide. So the shooter has committed to suicide. Having many firearms at their disposal makes it easier to commit suicide. It is probably going to be met with violence in the form of firearms as well. If you start shooting, likely someone will eventually be shooting at you. So again, the chances of being killed and the commitment to suicide really seems like the driving factor here that's making a lot of the other things come together, and that the firearm is the weapon of choice for the commitment to suicide. Are we there?
Thank you for bringing that up. Well, you've done your research. Wow. Thank you so much. That is such an important point. That is fundamental. The point about being met with firearms if you use a firearm. That is so fundamental. Thank you for bringing that up. So that's exactly the case. So when we talk about suicide, we're also talking about the so-called suicide by cop. Mm-hmm. So we know that's planned, again, because we've examined every case. And people who just, want to take their life at the time of do take their life at the time of the event, indicate beforehand that they want to take their life at the time of the event. So that we've published that. We know that that's the case. So that includes the so-called suicide by cop. That also goes to why people, for example, choose different venues or locations for their events. So, for example, why do people choose, schools, or why do people choose, different areas? Per capita, and this also goes into prevention, but per capita, what the most common, like per capita, per event, what the most common location for a mass shooting is? And when we're talking about mass shooting, I should also clarify the definition. When we talk about mass shootings, we're talking about what we refer to as personal cause mass shootings. These are mass shootings with a personal motivation. So this excludes war. This includes state or group sponsored terrorism. This excludes organized crime, gang violence. This excludes all of those things. This is personal cause mass violence. So the number one most common place where a mass shooting is perpetrated is a place where is a military installation. And we're not talking about war. We're not talking about state-sponsored terror. We're talking about these lone actors going to, Fort whatever.
Yep.
And knowing that they are going to be met with risk. They know that that's going to be the last thing the chances are very high that that's going to be the last event. That's also why they go to schools. They know that the response is going to be very strong and swift. Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing it up. That's a critical point.
Yeah. And it makes sense too. So we talked a little beforehand. I was in the U.S. Navy, and we often had drills about, what happens if an active shooter comes on the base and things like that. And at the time, it was presented under a sort of administrative group called Anti-Terrorism Force Protection, but it's not about terrorism. Hearing this now and your work, I'm understanding much more that it was about people who wanted to be met with force. I also used to be in Norfolk, Virginia, which is where the biggest Navy base in the world is. There was a shooting a couple of weeks ago at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia.
Yes.
Now, that looks like, from the outside, well, it was a school shooting. He went to a campus. But it was within the ROTC group. Yep. And from what people who were on campus that day seem to believe and have told me, apparently the man went in and confirmed that the classroom was ROTC before he started shooting, and he was killed in the event. So what looks like a school shooting may have been much more of, I want to confirm this is a place where I will be met by military people, dangerous people, and dangerous in the sense that they are very capable.
Yep.
And then be met with force and die. And that it was a suicide mission to, as you said earlier, go out in a blaze of glory. Are we kind of getting the picture now?
That is so, yes, 100%. That is critical. And that's actually, when we talk about prevention, the most critical point. Because when we try to figure out, how do we prevent this, et cetera, there are many ways, and we can talk about all the many different ways. But primarily, we have to understand these people, they're not looking to escape. Mm-hmm. Escape is not their plan. I mean, it's just not what they're looking for. They're not planning to get out of this. This is the end. They want this to be the end. And actually, there is a study published by I believe in the journal, I believe in JAMA Network Open, published by Peterson and Densley. They're investigators, I believe, from Minnesota. They are the creators of the Violence Project. They actually looked into this. Basically, they looked into whether having school safety officers decreases the risk of a mass shooting. And what they found is that having some sort of a safety officer actually increased the risk of mass shooting events, which is exactly what you would hypothesize from everything else I've been telling you. But that's actually already been demonstrated. It's really quite, I don't know whether to me, that's just scary. I don't think there's any other way to think about it, but that's very scary. And that's such an important point.
Well, and it's so counterintuitive. You would think that to a person who's thinking rationally, that a police officer in the school who is armed and capable would be a deterrent. But if you are looking to be met with force, then it is actually attractive, which is awful. That
is so fundamental.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at that can come directly from, again, everything we were talking about with regards to, narcissism and all these sorts of things. These people are destructive. Mm-hmm. These people have aggressive impulses with which they cannot deal. Mm-hmm. By definition, narcissism is destructive. That's what narcissism is. And that's why it leads to, or is so strongly associated with sociopathy or psychopathy or whatever. This is a destructive condition, and these are destructive characterological deficits.
Ragy, would there be other motives to use the firearm? Is the glamorization of violence, seeing things in the movies, imitation, video game type scenarios, is that also part of the picture here? What do you think?
Very much so. Very much so. So there are, we describe this, and so again, we're talking about different, different slices of a pie. So everything contributes to some degree, and then certainly there's overlap. But basically what we showed is that the per capita rate of mass shootings was very stable and low, but very stable up until about 1970. I mean, it didn't change decade by decade. And then starting in the 1970s, 1980s, the rate started increasing, and it's increasing. So the increase is increasing. So not only has the slope increased, but the rate of the slope is increasing. It's really quite scary. So the question is, what happened in the 1970s and the 1980s? Several things happened. And also, just to be clear, the rate of mass murder perpetrated with other methods also increased in the 1970s or 80s. It's very scary. So a couple things were going on. But one of those things is that pre-1970, 1980, the primary influences on young people were parents, were clergy, were teachers, those sorts of things. Post-1970, 1980, the primary influences, and this effect is continuing now, of course, with social media, is media. So, of course, we had television before 1970. We had, and bad media, not all media. I mean, there are good media like this, educational media. And then there's obviously, bad media or less adaptive media. So we obviously had TV and we had movies and we had radio. We had media before 1970s. But a lot has changed since the 70s and 80s. So, for example, people maybe some of the older people might, remember, we didn't have, for example, home movie rentals until like the 80s, until like the early, it was really really only became a thing in like the early 80s. Music television only became a thing in like the early 80s, those sorts of things. And then, of course, we had computers and then the internet and now social media. So again, there's obviously good media, but then there's also less adaptive media. And so in particular, violence is very infectious. Violence begets violence. And so we have very violent, and when we talk about violence, we're talking about gratuitous violence, which is now not just now, but has been an issue for a long time. So the entertainment media, we're talking about movies, we're talking about television, we're talking about video games, and we're talking about music, now romanticize violence and gun violence in particular in a way that is different than how violence used to be portrayed. Now it's like cool to be violent. It's cool to be violent with a gun. Violence is portrayed differently, or like firearms, for example, are portrayed differently now than they were before. And that is part of what is contributing to this mass shooting epidemic.
Mm-hmm. Ragy, your work at Columbia, does it overlap with John Mann and his brain studies on suicide and depression?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we collaborate a lot with Dr. Mann. He's amazing. It's great that you know Dr. Mann. That's fantastic.
Yes. Yeah. Well, suicide is a topic that's of a scholarly interest to me, I would say. And with his studies too, it seems that there are issues that he's finding of brain abnormalities that make people more susceptible to suicide. So the brains might be just different in ways that exacerbate depression or that exacerbate suicidal ideation. What do you find with brain structure and the people who commit these mass shootings, especially if it is so tightly linked to suicide?
Absolutely. Yeah, you've done your homework, or not just done your homework, you've been doing your homework for many years. You know this stuff very, very well. So we haven't done any biological studies on mass shooters per se. I don't think anyone has at this point, but we know a lot about violence, certainly, like neurobiological contributors to violence. So the neurobiology of suicide and violence very much overlap. There are many ways to think about it, but I think primarily, and also, so Dr. Mann and I, we both do positron emission tomography studies. So our focus is neurochemistry. So what's going on in the brains? What chemically speaking, is going on in the brains of people who suicide, like take their life, or who perpetrate violence in some way? There are many ways of looking at it, but I think fundamentally, people who are violent and people who perpetrate suicide or take their life, and again, there are many caveats and there are many ways to look at this, but a primary deficit is in serotonin signaling. So these people have deficits of serotonin activity and signaling. This is common to suicide and violence. And so that is a lot of what is going on.
So it's a brain change that makes them more susceptible to suicide and to violence?
Yes. And thank you. It's most related to the mechanism of impulsivity. So having low levels of serotonin increases your impulsive or your impulse discontrol.
Okay. So when I hear impulsivity, I think psychopath. But what you found is that actually psychopaths very rarely commit these sort of mass murders, and they're much more likely to be the serialized killer?
Right. So yeah, you're highlighting the overlap, which is extremely important. So psychopathy is very important. So psychopaths are different. So yes, you're right about impulsivity and psychopaths. Absolutely. Which again overlaps very much with narcissism. That is kind of a foundational. This problems with impulsivity and aggression, those sorts of things. That is foundational to psychopathy and sociopathy and narcissism. So again, they lie on a spectrum. That's why we focus more on, especially nowadays, spectrum more than categorical diagnoses, which are obviously still important, especially for clinicians, because we need to have categorical diagnoses for a lot of reasons. But either way, so when we talk about mass murder, mass shootings in particular, but mass murder in general, psychopathy is rarely seen as the motive for a mass murder or a mass shooting. Rarely seen. However, for example, one might say, well, that doesn't even make any sense. I mean, murderers are probably very often psychopaths or have psychopathic features or those sorts of things. So 20% of all types of murders, primarily, single and double murderers, but 20% of all murderers are psychopaths. And you know what percent of serial murders are psychopaths? You probably know this. Take a guess. You want to take a guess?
80.
87%. You're right. Exactly. No, very good. No, I knew you would get it, of course. 87% of serial killers, plus or minus a couple percent, are psychopaths. So what does that mean? So again, there are lots of contributors. Impulse discontrol is, part of all of these things, and certainly common to them. But again, it gets to motive. So what is the motive of a psychopath? What is of someone who has psychopathy? And just to be clear with people, psychopathy, as probably I imagine your listeners know, is a technical term. That is a diagnosis, psychopathy. So it's all about motive and why people do something, whether they want to be caught or not. Obviously, serial killers, for the most part, they don't want to be caught and they aren't taking their life, those sorts of things. And then serial killing is a lot different than mass murder. Serial killing often involves, a lot of a lot of other unfortunate things. What mass murder doesn't involve these, like dismemberment, cannibalism, some sort of sexual assault. So that is often part of serial killing. And so you can understand, there are clear differences. The motivation is just very different. We don't see almost ever, maybe it's happened. I can't even think of one. There's probably one or two cases out there, but a dismemberment almost never happens in mass murder, mass shootings in particular. Cannibalism, that's extremely rare almost never among mass murderers, if ever. Sexual assault is less common among mass murderers. So it gets to again, motivation and what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So it seems with serial killers, there's they say that there's the organized and the disorganized, that some are just in the moment, they murder someone. Whereas with the mass shooter, is it most often a planned out sort of thing? These things seem very orchestrated. The person often seems to show up well armed. They sort of scope out the place where they're going to attack, things like that. Is there often a lead up process?
Absolutely. And there is, and maybe this is to what you're referring. There is, again, the technical term is leakage. Or this is kind of the manifestation of the preparation or the lead up process. So just to confirm, yes, there is a lead up process. And again, speaking about prevention, there's leakage. Somebody often knows that this is going to take place. So whether that means that the person is posting somewhere online about this or a video about this, telling a family member, writing a note about this event, they are planning this. For some reason, they focus obsessively. So all of their aggressive impulses and all of their feelings of being rejected by society and ostracized by society and whatever it is, often in the case of young men, it's feeling ostracized or isolated or rejected by, potential romantic partners and whatnot. All of that, anger and those difficult feelings kind of funnel into or become focused onto, a school or a military base or the government or a group of people, like, for example, a group of people, for example, in like the synagogue shootings or the church shootings or when they're racially motivated. So all these feelings are for some reason usually quite arbitrarily, just kind of focused on this group. They just blame this group or these people or this organization for something. That happens over time. And again, there's leakage. And again, and then we unfortunately get the event.
So then someone like Elliot Rodger would be actually a more common model, someone who's writing manifestos, sort of leading up to this. There's a sense that he planned this, and then he just, in his case, I think he really was acting out against women. That's more common maybe than it would seem.
That's like a typical quintessential mass murder.
Okay.
That's exactly the case. And so again, in his case, these insults, and this is again why understanding psychodynamic theory and narcissism is so important. The feelings of being ostracized by or isolated by or rejected by, women or some sort of religious group or racial group or whatever. This is how the feelings, the narcissism, the feelings of inadequacy manifest. And that's into which they're funneled. But again, fundamentally, the problem is with these people. But then, yes, it's manifested as anger towards, women because they're rejecting someone, as in the case of the Isla Vista shooting, or again, a religious group or whatever. Yes, exactly. The Isla Vista case is really it's like a quintessential, typical mass shooting event.
Okay. So it sounds like the mass shooter is a lot like an otherwise healthy person who then eventually becomes suicidal, except for the narcissism and the fascination with guns. If you were to look at like the Joyner model of suicidality, thwarted belonging, perceived burdensomeness, and the capability for suicide. So the thwarted belonging and the perceived burdensomeness, I think we're understanding are pretty common in these situations. These people start to feel like they have nothing to offer. They feel like they're not connected to people. But then in this case, they take this violent narcissistic approach to the last piece, the suicide piece. So is suicide the core of this issue? What do you see with these overlaps?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So again, I'm sorry to keep saying this, but you really know your stuff,
Thank you.
as you should. That's amazing. So what is it's hard to, is there one single core? It's hard to say. I will answer this question, but I also kind of just want to comment on what you just mentioned. So yes, these people have characterological deficits, which are important to understand, but ultimately, as opposed to serial killers, mass murderers are actually, they're essentially, lots of people have characterological deficits. These people are otherwise relatively normal for much of their life. And they become radicalized in the general sense of the word. We often, when we think of radicalization, we might think of one thing, but radicalization, like psychologically radicalized because of whatever is going on in their life, again, rejection or whatever, they become radicalized towards, a gender or some sort of religious group or whatever. Yeah. And then that's what leads to the murder. But these are people actually, for the most part, besides their characterological deficits, do start out as relatively normal people. Again, that distinguishes them from the serial killer, which is like the psychopath, which is very different. Now, in terms of a core, yeah, it's really, the character deficit. So we refer to basically, proximal to distal contributors to mass shootings. So, very kind of, so proximal to the event, distal meaning most fundamental or, core. And then again, proximal meaning, somewhere where we could, intervene, but, not kind of foundational or fundamental. So for example, an example of that would be something to which you alluded before, which is the contagion effect and desire for infamy. That is that, one later stage motivating factor for mass shootings is just that mass shooters, before they perpetrate the event, see how much attention other mass shooters have received.
Yeah.
And they think it's great and cool, and they just kind of want to replicate that. So that's what we refer to as kind of, that's not foundational, but that's closer to the event, and it's somewhere we can intervene, but again, it's not core. Other things that contribute. So again, in the 5% of cases in which mental illness is involved, that is definitely a core problem. And when mental illness is involved, this basically means that the person is very psychotic, almost always a young person. They're not taking their medications, and they have a delusion and often hallucinations that are basically telling them to do this.
Yeah.
So, for example, I believe in the case of the Washington Navy Yard shooting from at least 10 years ago.
I think it was 2014.
Yeah.
Around there.
I believe that was motivated, if I remember correctly, from basically a persecutory delusion. Like they thought that people on the person, I believe, thought that the person on the people on the base were sending, some sort of radio or electromagnetic, some sort of signals into their mind. And so in their mind, they had a real delusion. And I want to remind people, people with schizophrenia have delusions. They believe these things as illogical as they might seem. These people genuinely believe, for example, that people are sending signals into their mind that they're going to, kill them or try to control them or whatever. And so that is usually the context in which a person with a mental illness perpetrates a mass shooting. It's terrible and we need to prevent it, but just so we understand kind of what might motivate different people. And again, how uncommon that's very uncommon, especially nowadays when we know more about schizophrenia, there's less stigma about schizophrenia and psychosis, and we prescribe medications much more, commonly, again, because of less stigma, we see that a lot less often. So other sorts of contributing factors. So guns, firearm availability and laws. Those are not foundational, but they have a huge effect. Maybe the greatest effect, probably the greatest effect, and where we can most intervene. Maybe not core, because again, for example, some people might say, well, we've had, for example, the Second Amendment, forever. What's changed now? And I would say people are right. So there might be somewhat of a disconnect between prevention and ultimate cause. So would, for example, having no guns fix mass shootings? As, for example, there's no Second Amendment in other countries. So technically, yes. But that's not, of course, as we mentioned, that's not the full story, because we've had the Second Amendment for some time. So we can intervene just with gun laws, for example. That would prevent a lot of mass shootings and suicide. But that's not the whole story. And there are other ways to intervene. With media, for example, and this romanticization of gun violence, which is almost certainly a major contributor to why many people in this country, for example, they're just less responsible with Second Amendment rights. So, I could go into maybe a little bit of history into, not just the Second Amendment, but gun ownership and how people handled guns, over times, if that's okay. But so, the Second Amendment is part of course, the Bill of Rights. In the 18th century, people had to have the government, as it was, especially before we were actually the United States of America, were actually in many cases, in many areas, required to have guns because we needed a militia and we needed law enforcement and those sorts of things. So people were required to have guns. And then we came into the 19th century, the 1800s, in which in some districts and locales, there was very little gun ownership. For example, in the Northeast, very little gun ownership. But in the West, with Manifest Destiny and our settlement of the West, everyone had to have a gun again. It was just necessary for protection, but also for hunting. People needed to eat. So it was required and necessary. And that's kind of how we understood guns. And then we came into the 20th century. And in the early 20th century, we actually don't have very good numbers on gun ownership rates. They were maybe as far as we can tell, probably in the 50% range. And again, hunting was probably the main reason why people had guns. And so in the context of that environment, people were very responsible with firearms. And then people started to hunt a lot less. The popularity of hunting decreased substantially, and actually gun ownership decreased substantially. I think it nadered around maybe 28, around 30%. I don't know, maybe 1980 or 1990, sometime around that period. And then we had media, and then we had the romanticization of gun violence. And since then, gun ownership rates have increased to about, I think maybe around 38% right now. And even more so than gun ownership rates, one might say, the gun ownership rate is lower now than it was before. So there are a few other things. That's why it's important to understand these nuances. It's not just, it's the Second Amendment or this or that or just gun ownership. So what is really going on? So number one, semi-automatic weapons became more common. It became easier to own a semi-automatic weapon as for someone who isn't in the military or part of law enforcement. So that's part of the problem. The other is the huge increase in just gun manufacturing and the number of weapons out there, especially owned per person. So what we have now is gun manufacturing has skyrocketed in the past few decades. It's out of control. We have 400 to 500 million guns now in America. It's hard to know for sure because only 1% of firearms in the U.S. are registered. But we have 400 to 500 million firearms. So many people own many guns, whereas before, most people would just own one gun. So now we have the problem where we have many semi-automatic weapons out there. They're semi-automatic handguns are the most popular weapons, as opposed to long guns like rifles or shotguns. So semi-automatic, like for handguns, are the most popular firearms now. So we have semi-automatic weapons. We have a lower gun ownership rate than maybe in the early 20th century, but many, many, many weapons per person. So people own many, many other weapons. And the number of illegal firearms is out of control. So the other big issue, and this is really where a lot of gun control advocates are focusing now, and rightly so. The issue now, a lot of the time, is that firearms are not being secured properly. They're not being secured. I mean, that's just it. Firearms need to be secured. So there's a lot of it going into it. There's the romanticization of gun violence. There's very, very irresponsible use and securing of firearms. There are many more illegal firearms, and the number of firearms owned per person has skyrocketed.
Mm-hmm. So there's this whole issue of more guns in America than people, certainly. And then we have the person who is likely to commit this sort of crime, the mass shooter, has the characterological deficit, as you said, the highly narcissistic, doesn't care about other people kind of thing. And they're suicidal. They're ready to die. And if you're highly narcissistic, you want glamour. You want attention. You want your life to look like a movie. Now, the movies that I see, the action movies, almost always, Act 3 of the movie starts with some sort of raid, some sort of assault on some kind of place where the good guy is going to go in and knock out a whole bunch of bad guys. And it just looks like a mass shooter kind of moment. And that's how action movies are often structured. And, TV shows, Jack Bauer comes in and wipes out a compound of 50 guys, you name it. The Matrix, they go in and they take out all the FBI guys in a building. So we have this movie-like image that this narcissistic person then can emulate and feel like if they're going to die, at least they're going to go out in style. I mean, how do we deal with that attraction of the violence in culture for that highly narcissistic person?
Yeah. So how to deal with it is that's a great question. Hard question to answer. I mean, there are ways to deal with it, but again, we don't want to infringe too much on people. I mean, we don't want to, our freedoms are important, and we don't want to just censor all the time and do all these sorts of things. We need freedoms, and that's critical.
Yeah. Maybe a more basic question: is it relevant that these movies set the example for what a mass shooting looks like?
Yes. So the answer to that is yes, definitely.
Okay.
Just the contagion effect. So I think the field has come to a consensus about that. Violence begets violence, and people, especially in our country, and in Western countries in particular, but especially our country, these are all basically forms of propaganda, and we are very susceptible to propaganda and what people tell us to do or what people tell us is cool, as opposed to in other countries, for example. So if we see a celebrity being violent and doing whatever, we are just going to model them or replicate them or act like them, unfortunately. I want to, and I'm going to address this more, but I also want to address what you were saying, something that you were saying. You were saying that narcissists, they want the fame and they want to take their life and all these sorts of things. And I would just add on to that, in addition, and again, the narcissists, they want to hurt people. That is fundamental to narcissism. So it's all of that.
Can you go deeper on that?
I'm sorry?
Could you go a little deeper on that? That they want to hurt other people? Because I think there's often this idea that someone who is highly narcissistic is acting out of defense and that they don't want to hurt anybody. They're just dealing with life the best they can.
It's exactly we know from theory and from studies. Again, it's the fundamental aggressive impulses. I mean, that's what leads to, and the inability to deal with the impulses and understanding. So think about a person who has, a great deal of narcissistic personality disorder or narcissism in general. They're feeling very bad. Nothing they do, regardless of what actually is the case. Again, it's not a delusion. I mean, sometimes you can get the point, but this is not a delusion in the schizophrenia, psychotic sense of the word per se. But this is an inability, because there are different types of delusions. But it's delusional sense of this. These people are, to some degree, they're out of touch with reality. They don't see what's really going on. They interpret signs and signals differently. So even if, for example, this person is very good looking, they're going to think that they're not good looking. For example, if this person is gentle and they're perceived as being a gentle and a nice person, they're going to perceive themselves as being aggressive and impolite. They might be friendly, but people might like them. Despite that, they're going to see themselves as being unliked. That's the problem, is that there's this low self-esteem. And then what happens is, one can't just go on feeling that way all the time. What happens is that, again, you project that. You begin to think, wait, this is very uncomfortable. Like why do I have so many problems? Why am I so inadequate? They begin to put those feelings onto other people. They began to tell themselves or think to themselves that they're not the problem. It's everyone else that's the problem. And then that just the next step of that is just that these people, deserve to be hurt because they're getting hurt. We don't want to make excuses for these people, but these people are suffering big time. And it's from the suffering, I think you mentioned this, it's from the suffering that comes the anger and the aggression. Imagine if, again, these people are telling themselves that that no one is physically attracted, they're undesirable in every way, physically, personality-wise, they're not smart, they have nothing contribute to society. Imagine if you were being told this by another person, but certainly by yourself constantly. It doesn't matter what is objectively the case. You're just constantly being beaten down in this way, in this case by yourself. You're going to respond. And unfortunately, that's kind of the case. That's not an excuse, but that is unfortunately what's going on with people who are dealing with narcissism.
So, Ragy, if the mass shooting is effectively a form of suicide, do people who are highly narcissistic personality disorder types commit suicide more often?
Oh, sure, definitely.
Okay.
100%. For example, let's think about a very kind of discrete, and I also don't want to forget, we are going to address the point that you mentioned about watching movies or celebrities, going around killing people, because that brings up a very important point. And I'm going to say it again. You've either watched every single video everything I've ever said on this, or you are just extremely good at this. So either way, it's amazing.
Thank you.
But no worries. I'm sorry for all the compliments, but it's really quite impressive. So we were talking, so let's think about a very explicitly and categorically defined group of someone who might display or manifest as narcissism. Someone with bipolar disorder in a manic phase. So so bipolar disorder in a manic phase, to people who aren't familiar, these are the people who, by definition, are extremely grandiose. They are arrogant in the manic phase. Again, this is a condition and a disorder. So these are people, when in the manic phase, there's no and there's no confusion or ambiguity about a manic phase. Manic phases are severe and they're dangerous. So one might think, so a person with bipolar disorder has an inflated self-esteem, a great sense of self-worth. They think they're extremely arrogant. They think they're on top of the world. They can accomplish anything. They're very goal-directed. One might think this is great. These people must think very highly about themselves. They would never want to take their own life. They must have a lower risk of taking their life than anyone in the general population. Even among these people, the risk of suicide is much higher. That's just kind of a way of kind of illustrating that regardless of how you look at it, it's worse, because anything that's pathological is going to cause that. But narcissism in particular makes suicide, taking one's life, much higher.
I see. Shall we talk about media, movies?
Yes. So the contribution is great. We talked about the romanticization of violence and gun violence and how that can affect someone and how that's related to the contagion effect and the effect of celebrity and this sort of propaganda or rhetoric, broadly speaking, on people. So just to even dial in more and, focus more on that, you referred to, and this is the point, you referred to the kind of the way that in the third act of these movies, you have in this case, the protagonist or the hero, using this very unique type of method of being violent or murdering people or taking one's life or exacting a revenge and as you know, as someone who's been in the military, or anyone might know who's maybe familiar with violence or how to use firearms, I guess particularly in the military, there are multiple methods of perpetrating a murder. But one is the sniper method. Mm-hmm. So the sniper method of using a firearm to affect your outcome as someone in the military or not is one maybe the most it's one strategy. It's one, and maybe it's a very common strategy. But we see that sometimes among mass shooters, but we actually rarely see that among mass shooters. And if you would think about it, that would give them the element of surprise. That would give them an ability to escape. And that method is actually associated with some of the events that have led to the highest number of fatalities. What we see actually is the rampage. We refer to it as the rampage method of mass murder. And that's, I think, what you're referring to. This is kind of like Hollywood's way of perpetrating violence or murder on television. It's where these protagonists or these heroes with no defense, no armor, nothing on, usually just like with a gun, just like go room to room, like walk up to people like a few inches away and, pull the trigger and affect their outcome. That is not a very realistic, it sometimes has to be used in reality, but that's not a very realistic way of perpetrating this sort of thing. However, that's what we see in the movies, and guess what? That's what we see in almost all cases of mass shootings.
And in video games,
where
too.
do people get this from? And video, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There are video games that will even, when you start to rack up a few kills, it will announce at you, running rampage. That exactly. You like, wow, you're on a roll. You're on a rampage right now.
That's it. So where do people get this from? Do they get this from real life or the military? No, they get it from video games and movies and television. It's very sad and very scary. Mm-hmm. If you think about the effect that Hollywood and entertainment media have on people, that is very scary.
How do we know that this is a connected factor? Because I'm sure that people will say, well, you can watch anything, or I've watched violent movies, but I don't do violent things. How do we know that it's actually connected to these activities?
Right. You're addressing that very important point. This is the limitation of research, for example. So ideally we would have like studies showing this very clearly. The best type of the highest quality study, for example, would be a randomized clinical trial in which we, randomize people to this sort of intervention or this for sort of exposure versus another exposure is not very possible. Some observational studies where we just examine these sort of phenomena over time have demonstrated this. And then we have to also just we just synthesize the data that we have and do the best that we can with it. Unfortunately, there are just limitations to the sorts of studies that we can kind of more explicitly carry out. But, we hope that theory converges with whatever data we have to some degree. And that's more how we've come to this conclusion. We have some data that aren't, great, but some epidemiologic and large cohort data suggesting this. And then we combine that with theory and we come to these conclusions.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking too about, we talked about John Mann's work and yours and brain scans and things. Now, if the shooter is most likely going to commit suicide with a gun, they're most likely going to shoot themselves in the head. So examining brains posthumously, probably not a worthwhile pursuit, or has that been done?
It'd be difficult. No, that's a good question. It certainly hasn't been done. It could be. It could be done. Theoretically, it could be done. It would be harder. It would be harder. It seems like harder, but it theoretically could be done.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of summarize what we know based on this discussion so far. So we have this phenomenon of these mass shootings. The person who is committing these mass shootings has a fascination with firearms. They're nihilistic. They have a desire for infamy. Doing this sort of activity puts them in a place where they can kill themselves because they want to die by going out in a blaze of glory. They can go on a rampage and they put themselves in places where they will be met with violence, in the violence that they're putting out. So they're going to schools with the police, who are going to come, to police installations, to military installations, places where they're going to be met with that fire and get into a firefight. We believe that some of this is the influence of media and culture, as well as the characterological deficit of the person. What can we do to address this going forward? And then, of course, there is the underlying issue that we've talked a lot about of just suicidality, particularly among, it seems to be mostly men in a certain age bracket. So there is that suicidality layer in there as well. What can we do about all of this?
Yeah, that's obviously the most important question. So we just address each of the different potential contributors. So with regards to firearms, for example, we need to be more responsible with firearms. I mean, seriously more responsible. So that includes, gun laws, but we can manage this without restricting, without too many restrictions and restrictions on freedoms. For example, just to throw it out there, I'm not sure how many people might be familiar with smart gun technology or something that would be like a smart gun technology. So, for example, there are many ways of explaining, or there are many types of smart gun technology. But for example, smart gun technology would be like using a fingerprint to activate a weapon. That's like smart gun technology. But there are other ways of doing this. I know a while back they were thinking of, along with every gun, selling, and this doesn't even have to be necessarily very high tech. It can be very basic. But for example, I think at one point they were thinking about, with every firearm, also selling a ring, so that the firearm would only work when it's within some certain, a few feet or 10 feet of the ring. So for example, that would really limit illegal use of firearms. And just to be clear, almost all weapons used in mass shootings are actually legal firearms, but there are still, firearms are, especially in many other types of crimes, illegal firearms are used, like firearms obtained, illegally, stolen or whatever, or given to people when they shouldn't be given to people. And that would limit those. That would also limit the many mass shootings that are perpetrated, using a quote unquote legal firearm, but when that legal firearm is used, for example, by like the son of a person who actually owns it, or the brother or something like that. So that's one example.
So with that element, so people who are committing these mass shootings, are you saying that they're not often the type who is already collecting many guns and has their own weapons that they've legally accumulated? That they're more likely...
They are. Most often they are. But even with that, the smart gun technology, so I think about 15% are perpetrated with illegal firearms, and then another, I forget the exact numbers, another maybe 15% are perpetrated with legal firearms, but used by like a close family member or friends of the person who has a legal firearm, like who was given the firearm, like quote unquote legally, like it wasn't stolen from them or legally transferred to them. So that, for example, would address, the 30 or 35% of mass shootings that
Okay.
are perpetrated with, illegal or quasi-illegal firearms.
Okay. So 15% for
Exactly.
each of those elements
Yes.
could knock out 30% of the cases where that person would not be able to use a gun if there was some sort of limit on the gun
Yes.
connected to the owner.
Yeah, or severely limit that. And of course, those numbers are much higher for other types of gun violence, just to be clear. So the other types of gun violence, like the percentage of, or the prevalence of, or the use of illegal weapons, for example, among many other types of gun violence is much higher. So that's just so the smart gun technology is one sort of potential intervention that could be used.
And a safety thing in the home too, I would think. Just,
Of course, yeah,
if you're a parent, you have a gun and that way, unless it's where you can see it, no one else could be using it.
Exactly. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, simple strategies like there really are solutions. It's more about the when you talk about if there's a will, there's a way or whatever. I think we have the ways. It's more about the wills at this point. But there are many. So for the 5% of cases in which mental illness is the problem, we need to do better at making sure, especially people with in the early stages of psychotic illness receive treatment, because virtually all violence, especially, murder, mass murder perpetrated people with mental illness are people in the early stages of their illness who are unmedicated. So these people need to be medicated. If we talk about the contagion effect, limit the amounts of information like the personal information we give, like the media give, like news media, for example, when they report on mass murder, that could decrease the contagion effect. With
That
regards to
decreases
media,
the glamorization for the narcissistic person,
exactly.
the sort of narrative that if you were to commit this sort of violent act, that you will be in the newspapers,
Exactly.
on CNN, people are going to know your name, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So
Okay.
don't show their pictures, for example.
Okay.
Don't show their pictures. That's that sort of thing. With regards to media, so we want to decrease, the romanticization of gun violence and violence in media. Tax credits to studios or entertainment media who kind of more responsibly portray gun violence. Those sorts of things. So those are ways.
At the individual level, would it be effective to simply curb the amount of violent media that you let your children see, things like that, or that you watch yourself?
Exactly.
Okay.
100%. And I was going there. So when we were all 100%, that was exactly that was perfect. My next point. So in terms of like the influence of people on people, that is the influence. So limit the influence. So especially with social media. So we have to understand social media it's less qualitatively different than all the media we have. It's more of a quantitative thing, like a dose thing. It's the dose we get with social media is so high.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking not all media. We're talking about like irresponsible media. It's the dose is so strong at this point. And we just need to limit it, especially like this, social media and those sorts of things.
Okay. What else?
And fundamentally, we go all the way back to, the core. I'm if I can share, I'm an observant Christian, for example. And so I do believe in evil and these sorts of things. And I think, there's something to it. Ultimately, this does come down to evil. And why is evil become so common? So, to give a much broader kind of 20,000 foot or 10,000 foot perspective on this, throughout history, for millennia, we've had wars and we've had famine. So natural evil and personal evil and violence of all sorts. And in about the middle of the 20th century, we came to the point where we have all of those sorts of ills, violence and other sorts of ills, all have decreased to such a low level, especially with regards to violence. So much less of it. We still have those sorts of things, of course, but all of these evils and types of violence decreased substantially, after World War II, essentially. But for some reason, this one sort of evil, it's a natural evil and it's also a personal evil, has been increasing. These mass murders, this phenomenon of violence, but this phenomenon of evil is becoming out of control. Especially in the West, but also in other countries to some degree. It's out of control. So why is this type of evil becoming so common? Uh, it's hard to know exactly why that's the case.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, Dr. Ragy Girgis, before we get to our last topic, for folks who want to follow along with you online, where's the best place to look for you?
Sure, yeah. Well, I just have a faculty website at Columbia University, so one could type my name in, and my name is relatively unique, so it's pretty easy to get to my faculty webpage. And I like interacting with people, and we've actually I have interacted with people who have found me online or through a podcast video sort of thing like this. So
Would you like to
one can
plug your
find me
book?
very easily.
Would you like to plug your book as well?
You're very generous. Thank you. Sure. I am about 5 or 6 years ago, and I actually, I did kind of write a book very much about evil and mental illness, and especially, the title of the book is On Satan, Demons, and Psychiatry: Exploring Mental Illness in the Bible, and that's where we kind of discuss mental illness in the Bible and the relationship with the demons and sin and evil, and how all of that kind of relates to each other, and how we can understand all of that, both from a pre-enlightenment perspective and a post-enlightenment, psychiatric perspective. So thank you very much.
Great. We'll put some links in the description for everyone to check out. And last of all, that's what I'd like to ask about is, what do you think people maybe misunderstand? What are the big misconceptions about evil and mental illness and things like that?
That they're related, that they're either one and the same thing, or that, mental illness comes from evil. Uh, it's not the case. That's the common understanding of it. And there are reasons why we understand it that way. Some of them related to kind of a pre-enlightenment understanding of from the religious perspective, like demon possession and that sort of thing, and how that it would be described. Now we have science in a post-enlightenment perspective, and we understand that what may have been described, for example, in the Bible as demon possession was probably more likely just mental illness, and there was no evil perpetrated by these people. And now there's a lot more to it, but it's become unfortunately more tribal and political. So now there are kind of strong feelings about, like, people actually refer to SSRIs, antidepressants, coming from the devil or demons, and there's that sort of rhetoric now that's become made this kind of dialectic intention even a little more problematic, unfortunately. And so those are the sorts of misconceptions we are trying to correct.
Yeah. Well, let's clear that up. Where did SSRIs come from, if not from the devil?
Right. So, apropos our previous discussion about suicidality and violence coming from, and impulsivity coming from low levels of serotonin, SSRIs, this is a kind of a just descriptively increased serotonin activity. So they do help. These are chemicals that were kind of identified serendipitously in the mid-20th century. So we've actually had these medications for a long time, or versions of these medications, and they were used to treat depression and psychotic disorders for decades. And then what they did in the 80s is they just kind of like used the previous medications and just made them more selective for the for the serotonin for the serotonin transporters. Before, the medications they were referred to as tricyclic antidepressants, like the amitriptylines, the imipramines, those sorts of medications. Those would bind to all types of reuptake inhibitors, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, but also norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, and sometimes even dopamine reuptake inhibitors. All the SSRIs are the same medications, just focusing on the serotonin receptors, serotonin transporters. So that's why they're called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We got those in the kind of mid to late 80s, and now those are just much more commonly prescribed. The reason we have these medications is because the older medications, which were non-selective, not only much harder to tolerate, just in terms of like side effects, they were dangerous. They were dangerous. Like, you could relatively easily, they were dangerous. There was a very toxic effect. So now the medications we have are less dangerous. We don't need to monitor blood levels, for example, those sorts of things. So they're much more easily tolerable and easier to prescribe. Let me be clear. They still have a lot of side effects. Lots of very uncomfortable side effects. But so compared to what we have, they're better. They still are very difficult to tolerate for a lot of people, and we have to do better. We're trying to do better, but yes, they did not come from the devil.
Good to know. Well, Dr. Ragy Girgis, for the work that you do to clarify things like that hopefully lead to people getting better treatment, for all of your work with the database and helping us all to understand these mass shootings and hopefully to prevent or reduce them, and for taking this interview with me, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad, for your work. Good media. You're an example of good media, so thank you very much, and thank you for having me on.